2 days ago, someone asked me to do the football war, so here it is. When you watch a heated soccer match today, you've probably noticed how intense things can get. Players get frustrated, coaches go ballistic, and fans can be so into the action that they actually storm the pitch. Even though soccer is called the beautiful game, tempers flare and passions run high. Now imagine if the stakes were much higher, like if an international friendly could mean going to war. Well, back in 1969, that is exactly what happened when El Salvador and Honduras went head-to-head on the pitch in a World Cup qualifier. The resulting conflict would become known as the Football War or the 100-Hour War. And it all kicked off because of some very specific circumstances that left a whole lot of people angry. To understand what led to the Football War, we need to take a look at El Salvador and its relationship with its neighbor, Honduras. You see, El Salvador was and still is a small country. It's almost as densely populated as Bangladesh and has always been short on arable land. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans have emigrated to neighboring countries throughout history. By the mid-20th century, large numbers of Salvadorans had settled in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Mexico, and Honduras. But it was in Honduras where the largest community of Salvadorans had taken root. By the late 1960s, an estimated 300,000 Salvadorans lived in Honduras. Many of them had arrived in the 1960s during a wave of migration prompted by El Salvador's volatile political situation. There was also the issue of land reform. The Salvadoran government had implemented a reform in the early 1960s that redistributed land from wealthy landowners to poor citizens. While this may sound like a good idea, it didn't go very smoothly. Some of the wealthier folks who lost land fled to neighboring countries like Honduras, bringing their money with them. Meanwhile, in Honduras, the economy was booming thanks to the end of World War II, which created huge demand for products like bananas and coffee. These were Honduras's main exports, which meant that Honduras needed workers to take advantage of the economic opportunity. This combined with the volatile political situation in El Salvador created a perfect storm that sent hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans pouring over the border into Honduras in search of better lives for themselves and their families. Unfortunately, the warm welcome didn't last. As more Salvadorans moved to Honduras, resentment grew among the native population. Many Hondurans felt that the Salvadorans were taking their jobs and housing. Others saw them as a threat to their national identity. The feeling was mutual. Salvadorans were viewed as second-class citizens in Honduras and were often denied access to decent housing, healthcare, and education for their children. Tensions between the two groups continued to rise over the next several years until finally in 1969, things boiled over. That year, Honduras passed a land reform law that took land away from many of those same Salvadorian migrants and gave it back to Hondurans. Naturally, the Salvadorans were furious. Many of them had worked hard for decades to carve out a piece of land for themselves only to have it taken away. And so, when Honduras and El Salvador squared off in World Cup qualifiers for the 1970 tournament in Mexico, tempers flared. The first match was on June 8, 1969, in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. And while the atmosphere was tense, the game itself was rather lackluster. Honduras ultimately won 1-0, but the Salvadorans weren't having it. They claimed that the goal was scored illegally, that Honduran fans harassed and attacked Salvadoran players, and that the Honduran team had fielded an ineligible player. Salvadoran officials lodged protests with FIFA and the Honduran Football Association, but none of them stuck. On top of that, Salvadoran players and fans reported being harassed and attacked by Honduran fans in the streets, which added fuel to the fire. The second match was played 3 days later on June 15, 1969, in San Salvador. And this time, El Salvador won 3-0. But as the final whistle blew, the Salvadoran fans went wild. They stormed the pitch and beat up Honduran players. A Honduran fan was stabbed to death, and another disappeared. Things got even worse in the stands where fights broke out between Salvadoran and Honduran supporters. Soon, the violence spilled onto the streets of San Salvador. Crowds gathered outside the Honduran embassy, but it was soon overwhelmed by thousands of Salvadorans. They shouted, "Hondurans out of El Salvador," and set fire to anything Honduran they could find, including buses. By the time order was restored, 7 Hondurans had been killed and dozens more injured. As for the Salvadorans, they didn't fare much better. One man was shot dead, and dozens more had been injured by police. With a tie score heading into the third and deciding match, the stage was set for an explosive conclusion to the series. And before we get to what happened next, now back to the video. The third and deciding match was played on June 26, 1969 in Mexico City. It was a hard-fought battle, but El Salvador managed to win 3-2 after extra time. However, by then soccer wasn't the real story. The June 15th match in San Salvador had lit the fuse and emotions were running high. There were fears of renewed rioting in the streets, and many Salvadorans called for a boycott of the game. Tensions were high in Mexico City as well. Before the game, both sets of fans had clashed in the streets, and there was even a riot in the stands during the first half. In the end, the game went ahead without major incident, but it was clear that things were escalating beyond the world of soccer. In fact, after the game, El Salvador declared a state of siege, a precursor to martial law, and closed its borders. For its part, Honduras did the same thing, declaring a state of alarm and shutting down its borders. And then on July 14, 1969, El Salvador launched a surprise military offensive against Honduras. Salvadoran troops crossed the border and immediately began bombing targets throughout Honduras, including 2 airports. They also strafed a Honduran army barracks, killing and wounding dozens of soldiers. Honduras was caught off guard at first and couldn't mount an effective defense. But soon, the Honduran Air Force took to the skies and began dropping bombs of their own. Within hours, they crippled El Salvador's supply lines by bombing oil facilities and air bases. On the ground, the 2 armies clashed along the border, but neither side was able to gain any real territory. The fighting was fierce, but it lasted only 4 days. By July 18, 1969, the Organization of American States stepped in and brokered a ceasefire. Fighting ended and the war was over. But the border dispute remained. A peace treaty was eventually signed in 1980, and the final settlement wasn't reached until 1992. In the end, the football were left around 3,000 people dead, most of them civilians, and about 6,000 wounded. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of the conflict was that nearly 100,000 Salvadorans living in Honduras were expelled back into El Salvador, creating a massive refugee crisis. Today, it's remembered as the Football War or the 100-Hour War, and it remains one of the most famous examples of sports mixing dangerously with politics. So what do you think? Could a soccer game really spark a war today? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more history snacks.